Hello, my name is Kimberly Gotches. I tell stories that connect people from across the generations. Some of the most significant relationships in my life have been with my many grandparents. I'd like to tell you a story today about my Greek grandmother, Yaya, the missing ingredient. Let me take you back to my freshman year in college. I'm about to come home for Christmas break and I am craving Yaya's pasticho, her buttery mashed potatoes, her Turkish meatballs that are allowed in her all-Greek kitchen because they're just so good. But most of all, I'm craving Yaya's rice pudding. But when I get back from Christmas break, I find that Yaya's dementia has reached the boiling point. She left a burner on her kitchen stove, and a fire engulfed her kitchen. The firemen found Yaya staring at the flames, her orange hair glowing along with the fire. "Didn't you hear the alarms and sirens?" Mom asks. Yaya just looks at Mom, at me, at the landlord, at the firemen, and a blank look, as if smoke is covering her eyes, covers her as she looks at us. "This is not about hearing," the fireman says. "This woman should not be alone." Now Sal, the Italian landlord, has known Yaya for over 20 years, and he looks down at the floor, scuffing his boots before he says, "She can stay through the holidays." So we decide to spend this last Christmas Eve at Yaya's apartment, the apartment where I grew up. When we walk in the door, Yaya opens the door and calls out, "Sweetheart!" The sweet is high and shrill, and the heart is light and airy. This is the Yaya that I knew. She takes my hands, and her hands are shaking, and she guides me into the kitchen, and she looks at the stove, and she says, "I tried to make your rice pudding." And my heart just breaks. I used to sit at Yaya's kitchen table while she made this rice pudding. I'd be engulfed by the smells of cinnamon and butter and rice, and Yaya would glide across the kitchen floor, opening cabinets, closing drawers. And I would tell her about my day. I'd tell her about school, and I'd tell her about the girls that were mean. And one particular time, I remember Yaya dished out some very memorable advice. Susie Smith had just told all the girls my secrets that I shared, and Yaya took out her pointer finger and said, "The proof is in the pudding." I looked closer at the pudding, looking for a proof, and Yaya just laughed, and she tried to explain, and she said, "Be careful what you share with those girls, for when you share a secret, you share a part of yourself." And at that point, the pudding was almost ready, and Yaya put a little bit of her secret ingredient in that pudding. And I never asked what it was. You see, I never imagined there could be a time that Yaya would not be there to make this pudding. Now, when the pudding was just about ready, it would go into the refrigerator, and it had to cool, and it had to thicken. And I would open the fridge and peek in, and I'd want to eat it, but Yaya would take out her finger again and point at me, and I would back away. I was so impatient, but finally, when it was time to have it, we would put embroidered napkins on our laps, and we'd put the pudding in glass goblets with long stems. We'd take our spoons, and the one thing Yaya and I always did together was lift our pinkies as we ate our rice pudding. It was one of the only times she lifted a finger other than her pointer. So you see, that last Christmas that we spent at Yaya's, we avoided the kitchen at all costs. We got carry-out food from the Greek islands and ate it in the living room. And we're eating it and taking in the Christmas tree and anything that feels familiar when Yaya stands up. "I'll get the pudding," she says. Mom says no right away and tries to guide Yaya back to the couch, but she's determined. And the only thing I can think to ask is, Yaya, where is the recipe? And she looks at me again with those smoky eyes. The recipe, I say. I enunciate each word as if the way I say it will make a different outcome. But Yaya just looks at me blankly. I panic and I bundle her in her coat and we go towards the door. Mom says, where are you going? And I say, the grocery store. And Mom nods, I'm coming with you. We walk up and down the aisles of the grocery store, rushing through the aisles like grains going through an hourglass, like grains that represent memories, and we only have time to save one. I'm pointing at items and pointing, and Yaya is nodding every time I point at everything that I point at. And soon I notice she is nodding at everything I point at. So I try to test her and point at some chili spice, and she nods, and my heart just sinks. Is this the end? Will we never know Yaya's secret ingredients? Whole milk, Mom says. And I have hope because I know she's right. You see, Yaya never used anything fake, otherwise known as low fat. So we have whole milk, and between Mom and I, we fill the cart with the rice and the butter and the cinnamon and the eggs. But something is missing, and I wonder, is this how Yaya feels walking up and down aisles with something always missing? Eventually, we have to give up. And we return home, and Mom rests in the living room, and it's just Yaya and me and one working burner. I take out all the ingredients that we have, and I say, we can do this. And I take a deep breath, and as I do that, Yaya begins to grab her favorite pan, and she starts to boil water. And for a moment, she is gliding through a ritual that goes beyond memory. And I watch her melt the butter, and I start to have hope bubble up inside of me that maybe she'll even remember the missing ingredient. I have to wipe my eyes with a napkin because they're starting to tear, and when I open my eyes, Yaya is climbing the kitchen counter. Get down, I say. And Mom runs from the living room, and we're trying to tell Yaya to get down, and she's reaching for the cabinet, and the water is boiling, and the counter is groaning where the fire spots are underneath her feet. And Yaya turns, and she smiles with a mischievous smile, and I can't help but remember when her and I cooked in just our underwear when the air conditioning went out, and we even took pictures like we were Victoria's Secret models. Mom and I help Yaya down from that counter, and Mom is so worried she doesn't notice Yaya place a bottle in my hand. And I feel the cool glass of the bottle, and I hear the words Yaya always said. The proof is in the pudding. And I know she is sharing a part of herself with me. She's sharing her secret with me. And I put a little bit of that secret into our pudding. And again, it's just Yaya and I. And Yaya stirs in that ingredient. And before it's done, she takes the spoon and she hands it out to me. But I don't want to take it. You see, this is Yaya's rice pudding. But she holds out the spoon and she's waiting. And so I do. I take the spoon and I stir. And Yaya nods. And when she's ready, she turns down the heat. And we sit at the table together while the pudding simmers, and it's like Yaya's memories simmer. I ask her every question I could think of. Yaya, why did you choose Papu? Yaya, were you always a size 6? Yaya, what made you the most happy? And her memories continue to bubble while that pudding simmers. And I want that moment to last forever. And in exactly 90 minutes, as if an internal bell goes off inside of Yaya, she stands and she turns off the heat and the pudding is ready. And we put it in the fridge and we wait. And again, I am not impatient. I do not peek in that fridge. I want this moment to last forever. And when it's time, we put our embroidered napkins on our laps and we put our pudding into our glass goblets. And together, in a ritual that goes beyond memory, Yaya and I lift our pinkies together. This story is about meeting a stranger who becomes like family. I'll take you back to after Christmas break, my freshman year in college. I had just spent Christmas break with my grandmother and been noticing she was slipping away with dementia. And at this time, I was taking a class called The Development of Adulthood and Aging. We were given an assignment to interview an older adult and get their life story. Now you see, everyone in my class right away set up phone conversations with their grandparents. And I was very aware that I could not do this. Our teacher had given us a list of questions we had to ask, and I knew it was too late to get answers to any of these questions. But I still had to do the assignment. So I took a deep breath, I grabbed a handful of quarters, and I took 2 buses to the closest nursing home, the Havenwood in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I run into the nursing home, go through the automatic doors, I go to the first nurse that I see, and she doesn't even mind that my hair is frizzy. I'm even wearing 2 different shoes. And I say, I need to talk to someone, anyone. And the nurse nods. Aloma likes to talk, she says. I wait in the activity room for the nurse to go get Aloma. And she brings in a woman with long white hair and a braid that swings behind her wheelchair. And she's sitting on a hot pink seat cushion. And there's wrinkles on her face that make it look like she's permanently smirking at us. I'm not sure what to say. I just say, how are you? And Aloma answers, fine as a frog's hair. And I'm distracted. I'm trying to think, do frogs have hair? And I have to bring myself back to the moment and ask what I came to ask. So I say, Aloma, may I hear your life story? And she gets real serious and she looks at me and says, you get me a Pepsi and we'll talk. And I do. I sneak out, I go behind the nurses, I grab a Pepsi from the vending machine and I bring it back. And we share that Pepsi in little plastic cups. And over that Pepsi, Aloma tells me the first of many stories. And you see, I was missing my grandmother, and I was missing my family, and I was missing other loved ones in my life. And Aloma, too, was missing the loved ones of her life, and I never found out why I was the only person still visiting her. But somehow, through the stories that she shared and the stories that I shared, we saved each other. I'd like to tell you a story that belongs to Aloma, the woman I met at the Havenwood nursing home who became like a grandmother to me. The story is called How I Got My Brother. Let me tell you how I got my brother. You see, I lived with Ma and Pa, my grandparents, on an island in the middle of the Snake River. Pa had land on the Idaho side that he paid taxes on, and he had land on the Oregon side that he paid taxes on. But he didn't pay a cent on that island. You see, Idaho and Oregon were still fighting over it. And Pa leased out the lower part of that island to a man woman and their son. And I just begged Pa, Pa, please let me meet their son. But we had to wait until the day that they did not come up with their lease payment. So Pa got the dog into the little boat, he got me into the little boat, and himself into the little boat, and we traveled down to the lower part of that island. And when we got there, everything was taken care of, but there was no one around. So Pa went up to the house, and me, I went to the little calves pen. You see, I love little calves. I was in the pen, and I was leaning in to give one a little pat, when all of a sudden, the haystack behind me sneezed at me. Oh my, oh boy, I went running, and I went, Pa, the haystack behind me sneezed at me. And Pa nodded. We'll go check out that sneezing haystack, he said. And we did. We went back to the calves' pen, and we looked, and behind the haystack, a little tuft of orange grew. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew until it was a full-grown boy. The sun was behind him. It was so bright I could barely believe my eyes. I had to squint, but it was a boy. And Pa said, what are you doing here? Where are your parents? And the boy said, they left. They left you? And the boy looked down at his bare feet and, yep, they did. Now Pa said, what's your name, son? And the boy said, my name is Ron. And that's when Pa took out his hand and he held it out straight just like he did when my parents left me. And he said 3 times, I take Ron as my son. I take Ron as my son. I take Ron as my son. That was Pa's way of adopting. So we got to take Ron home, and I shared all my toys with him. You see, Ron was Apache French, and I was Comanche French, but we got along just like 2 peas in a pod. But before long, Pa's lawyer, Mr. A.L. Fletcher, heard about our new boy, and he thought he better see what's going on. So he came by and he said, you know you can't just take a boy like that. You have to go to the judge. And Pa said, I ain't afraid to go to the judge. You see, Pa took the judge hunting every year. Now somehow, Mr. A.L. Fletcher found Ron's folks, and I don't know what he threatened them with, but whatever it was, they agreed to give their rights to Pa. And we went in front of the judge. And the judge said to Pa, Ira, this is a big responsibility. You already have one little girl there. I bust out of my chair. I threw both arms around Ron and I just said, I want him. The judge smiled. He said, well, I guess it's settled then. And that's how we took Ron home as my brother. I'd like to tell you a traditional tale I have adapted in honor of my many grandparents, especially my grandmothers. The mountain where old people were abandoned. Not long ago, and not so far from neither here nor there, we abandoned our elders to the other side of the mountain. When they were too weak to hold our tools, too slow to keep our attention, and too wise to let us make our mistakes, it was time to say goodbye. I was grandmother's only grandchild. Everyone used to say we used to look exactly alike, but this was hard to imagine with grandmother's thin white hair and my thick dark hair. And grandmother's eyes were hazel like mine with green specks, but my green specks glowed like emerald light, and hers were dull like blades of grass. And grandmother's back was curved in the shape of a question mark, which pressed upon me the question, must I take grandmother to the other side of the mountain? Now, the last time that grandmother and I cooked together one of her favorite meals, her hand began to shake, and grandmother handed the spoon out to me. Now I knew what this meant, and I didn't want to take the spoon, but she waited, and so I did. And while I stirred, grandmother made plans to go tomorrow on her journey to the other side of the mountain. And that day, the next day, at dawn, grandmother took her most favorite scarf and she put it over her head and she tied it under her chin and nodded. And we began on our journey, and we journeyed towards the mountain. And while we did, I asked grandmother every question I wished I had started earlier to ask. Grandmother, why did you choose grandfather? Grandmother, what is it that makes you happy in life? Grandmother, please tell me everything I need to know. But there wasn't enough time. And as we walked, grandmother took her scarf and she filled it. She filled it with berries along the path. And I didn't know if there would be food for grandmother on the other side of the mountain. You see, no one had ever returned from the other side. And I asked grandmother, have you ever been on this path before? And she nodded when I took my grandmother. Now, as we walked, grandmother became more and more slow. And soon she was unable to walk on her own, and I took grandmother onto my back. And as we walked, she became more and more heavy, and my back curved along with grandmother. And I knew grandmother's back is not curved because she is weak. Her back is curved because she carries years and years of experience, and she is strong because of it. Now, when we got to the peak of the mountain, the trees swayed as if they were waving goodbye. And grandmother took her scarf and she put it on my head. And she tied it under my chin and kissed my cheek. And she was the first to turn, and she was the first to go. And I couldn't watch her. So I turned my back to grandmother. I turned my back to the mountain, and I began to walk home. But I'd never been this far away from home. I didn't know if I could make it home without grandmother, and that's when I saw the streak of red. Grandmother had left every last berry that she had picked for herself. She left for me to find my way home. The first day home without grandmother, I tried to cook her recipes, her comfort food, but there were no recipes and I had no comfort. On the second day without grandmother, I found a photo album with unlabeled pictures, and I knew I would never know who these people were in these pictures. Only grandmother knew who these people were. And on the third day without grandmother, I found letters to her from a lover who was not grandfather. And the questions burned inside of me, and I had to know, and I decided in the dark of night, I went back to the other side of the mountain. And there I found grandmother, and she was more frail than ever, but her eyes glowed and the green was an emerald light. And I took her scarf And I put it over grandmother's head and I tied it under her chin, and she nodded. And together, the light glowing from our eyes led us back home. And I took grandmother into my bedroom and I hid her there. And we hid underneath the covers of my bed. And we whispered like we were on a sleepover, and I asked her every question I could think of. And grandmother told me stories upon stories about our history, about our tradition, about who we used to be. And at that time, the people in our community were quarreling with each other. They were fighting over the land. They were fighting, and there was never enough. But grandmother told me stories about how things used to be, about a time when there was always enough. And I took those stories to the leader of our community day after day. I told stories of our history, our tradition, our memories. And one day, the leader had an assistant who followed me home. And that assistant uncovered grandmother. And we were brought to trial. And the leader had me on one side and grandmother on the other. And the leader put one hand on my rigid straight back and one hand on the soft curved back of grandmother and said, "Because you refuse to turn your back on grandmother, because you refuse to turn your back on grandmother, we have our history, our tradition, our memories. Because you refuse to turn your back on grandmother, we will always have enough. Never again will we abandon our elders to the other side of the mountain. And when it is time for them to take their final journey on their own, we will hold their stories for them. We will tell their stories for them. And so